cast out with nothing but pocket change and a worthless deed, an orphaned servant girl inherited a ghost town that had been entirely erased from every map. Her cruel family laughed, assuming the abandoned wasteland would be her grave. They had no idea the town was deliberately wiped from existence to cover up a deadly corporate conspiracy. And they never suspected this discarded girl would use that rotting settlement to expose a blood-soaked secret, destroy a powerful syndicate, and claim a breathtaking, untouchable empire. Settle in with me and tell me in the comments where you're watching from tonight, because this one takes its time. Elizabeth had been born in a two-room house on the wrong end of a wheat town called Bell Run, the only child of a father who drove freight and a mother who took in mending, and both of them were gone before she was 12. Her father went first, thrown from a wagon on a bad grade outside Junction, and her mother followed the next winter quietly of a cough that no one in that country had the money to treat. After that, Elizabeth had been passed sideways rather than down to her father's older sister, Adele, a hard, tidy woman who ran a boarding house and considered the child a line in her ledger rather than a person in her care. Adele fed her, clothed her in altered dresses from departed lodgers, and set her to work at 8 years old, scrubbing porches and turning mattresses. And she made it plain in 100 small ways that any softness spent on the girl was softness wasted. The person who saved Elizabeth from becoming small under that roof was her mother's mother, a woman named Hetty Fletcher, who lived alone on a quarter section 3 hours east of Bell Run, and who came in by wagon once a month to collect her granddaughter for what she called visiting. Hetty was 71 when Elizabeth was 10, widowed twice, and she had run her own place since the second husband died of a horse kick in 1878. She taught Elizabeth what the boarding house never would. She taught her to read a plat map and a weather sky, to set a snare and dress a rabbit, to mix lye soap in a kettle and pour candles into tin molds, to sharpen a plain iron on an oil stone, to a window with rag and tar, to shoe a patient horse and calm an impatient one, to keep a ledger in 2 columns so that no man could later claim she owed what she did not. She taught her more than anything to look at a broken thing long enough to see whether it was actually broken. Because most of what people threw away, Hetty said, had only been misunderstood. The tin whistle came from Hetty. It had belonged to Hed's own brother, a boy named Wilford, who had died at 16 of a fever in 1859, and Hetty had carried it in her apron pocket for more than 50 years, and then pressed it into Elizabeth's palm. The winter she turned 15. It was a plain thing, 3 1/2 in of hammered tin, dull silver at the mouthpiece where lips had worn the finish. 6 holes, a small dent under the second hole where Wilford had dropped it once on a stone. I said only. This played for a boy who never got old, and now it will play for a girl who is going to. Elizabeth kept it in the inside pocket of her coat from that day forward, closer to her ribs than to her hand. Hetty died the spring. Elizabeth turned 17, of nothing in particular, and everything at once, the way patient old women sometimes do, and the quarter section was sold at once by cousins Elizabeth had never met, to satisfy debts Elizabeth had never heard of. She was given a mourning brooch she did not want, and told politely that there was nothing else. She went back to Adele's boarding house, and to the mattresses and the porches, and she worked those 2 years the way Hetty had taught her to work, which was to say fully and without complaint, and she saved every coin she was allowed to keep. Not many, because Adele took most of them for what she called room and board and general upkeep, until by the summer she was 19, she had exactly $460 rolled in a strip of chambre inside the bottom of her sewing basket, along with the whistle and a small photograph of her mother at 18, and a folded page of Heed's handwriting that listed the 12 knots she considered a woman ought to know. She did not know in those 2 years that anyone else in the world was thinking about her at all. She did not know that a letter had been mailed from a lawyer's office in Kansas City to Bell Run in the spring, addressed to her by name, and that Adele had signed for it and put it in the top drawer of the sideboard and left it there unopened for 11 weeks. Because Adele had already decided that whatever it contained would be either nothing or trouble. Elizabeth found it on a Tuesday in July, when she was sent to fetch a napkin ring, and she read it standing at the sideboard with the drawer still open, and she understood, before she reached the second paragraph, that a great uncle she had never met, a man named Josiah Fletcher, who had once been her grandfather's younger brother, had died in a rooming house in St. Joseph and had left to her his only traceable blood. The entire remaining title of an unincorporated settlement in the western grass country called Dry Creek, a place, the lawyer wrote, that the county had ceased to acknowledge in the year 1889, and that no current map showed, but to which the deed filed in the state archive still legally attached. She refolded the letter, put it in her pocket next to the whistle, closed the drawer, and finished setting the table for supper without saying a word to anyone about it. That was how Hetty would have done it. That was how, from that afternoon on, Elizabeth Fletcher began to do everything. She kept the letter in her pocket for 4 days before she moved on it. And in those 4 days, she did nothing that would have looked to Adele or to any of the lodgers unusual. She washed the porch on Wednesday. She turned the mattresses in the 2 east rooms on Thursday. She mended a torn sheet on Friday by the window in the pantry, and she pressed 6 shirts on Saturday morning. And while she pressed them, she thought carefully about what she would need and what she could carry and what she was owed and what she was willing to leave. On Saturday afternoon, she walked to the depot in Bell Run and asked the ticket clerk, a thin man named Mr. Purty, who had known her father, what it would cost to ride the westbound as far as Sagebrush Halt, which was the nearest stop the lawyer's letter had named. And Mr. Purty told her £3.40 one way, and she thanked him and walked back. That night, she counted her money again in the pantry by lamp, and it was still $4.60. 60 cents. And she put it back into the strip of chambre and tied the chambre with a slip knot Hetty had taught her, and she went to bed. On Sunday morning, she came down early with her sewing basket, and inside the basket was everything she owned in the world, folded small. 2 work dresses, 1 wool skirt, 3 pairs of stockings darned at the heels, a nightdress, the mourning brooch she had not worn since Heed's funeral, the photograph of her mother at 18, the folded page of knots, the tin whistle, the $4.60, the deed, and the lawyer's letter. She set the basket by the kitchen door, and she made the coffee, and she laid the breakfast out on the sideboard, the way Adele preferred it. Plates warmed, butter turned, salt fresh in the cellars. Then she went into the parlor where Adele was reading the church paper, and she said plainly that she was leaving on the noon train, and that she had a place to go, and that she would not be back. Adele did not look up for a long moment, and when she did, she said only that Elizabeth was a fool if she thought any man in Kansas City had left her anything worth the fare, and that the door would not be held open. And Elizabeth said she did not require it to be. Adele told her she owed for the last 2 weeks' upkeep, and Elizabeth counted out 60 cents onto the small table beside the reading lamp, which was what she calculated the 2 weeks came to, at the rate Adele had always named. And she picked up the sewing basket, and she walked out the front door and down the porch steps and along the road toward the depot without turning around. She was 19 years old. She had $4 in her pocket and a whistle in her coat and a deed to a town that did not exist. And she did not cry. And she did not look back at the boarding house. And she did not slow her step until she reached the platform where Mr. Perry tipped his hat and sold her the ticket and told her quietly that her father had been a decent man and that he was glad to see her going somewhere. She thanked him. She sat on the bench with the basket on her lap, and she waited 2 hours and 11 minutes for the train, and in that time she opened the basket only once, to touch the whistle with the pad of her thumb, and to close the lid again, and to fold her hands over it. The train came in at 12 minutes past noon, and she boarded a second-class car near the middle and took a seat by the window on the north side, because Haydee had once told her that if you were riding west in summer, you sat on the north side to keep the sun off your face and the dust from settling in your lap. The car smelled of pipe smoke and old varnish and the sweet oil the porters used on the seat brackets, and Elizabeth set the basket at her feet and pressed her ankles against it and watched Bell Run slide backward past the window. The water tower, the grain elevator, the 2-room house on Sumner Street, where she had been born, the small white church, the road that ran east toward what had been Head's quarter section and was now someone else's Alalfa. She did not look for long. After the town, the wheat began, and after the wheat, the pasture, and after the pasture, a low country of yellowing grass that seemed to have no end, and to be attached to no particular place. And she watched it for hours without tiring of it. And she ate a piece of bread from the basket at 4 in the afternoon, and a second piece at 7. And she drank from the tin cup the porter filled for her, twice. And she did not speak to anyone. The train ran through the night with the windows down and the summer wind smelling of dry sage and warm iron, and she slept sitting up with her cheek against the wooden frame and her hand inside her coat pocket around the whistle. And she woke twice, once at a cawing stop where lanterns swung along the platform and men shouted numbers, and once when a woman across the aisle began to weep quietly into a folded handkerchief for reasons Elizabeth did not ask about. By dawn, the country outside the window had gone from grass to short grass, and from short grass to something drier and lower and more open. With the horizon pulled so far back, it looked bent, and the first pale hills to the west rose out of it, like the shoulders of animals lying down. She reached Sagebrush Halt at 10:15 on Monday morning, and she stepped down onto a plank platform in front of a single unpainted building, and the wind was already moving hard across the flat, and she stood a moment with the basket in her hand, and understood, without being told, that from here on she would be walking. The station master, an old man with a sun-cracked neck named Mr. Anninsley, looked her over once and asked where she was headed, and she said, "Dry Creek." And he was quiet for a long moment before he said that Dry Creek was 14 mi north by the old freight cut, and that nobody had asked him about it in 7 years. She thanked him. She asked if there was water on the road, and he said there was a windmill at the 6-mile mark that still pulled. And she thanked him again, and she filled the small canteen from her basket at the pump behind the depot. And she started walking north into the wind, with the sun climbing behind her right shoulder, and the grass moving in long pale waves on either side of the wagon track. And she did not stop for the first 3 hours, except to shift the basket from one hand to the other. She reached the windmill at a little after 2:00 in the afternoon, and the blades were turning in a slow, uneven groan, and a rusted tin trough beneath the pipe held perhaps 2 in of clean water, still moving in the wind. And she drank from her cupped hand, and refilled the canteen, and rested for a quarter of an hour in the strip of shade thrown by the tower. Then she walked on, and the country climbed by inches without seeming to climb at all. And by 5:00, she saw the first sign of Dry Creek, which was a leaning post with the bleached remains of a signboard nailed to it, and no letters left. Beyond the post, the wagon track dipped into a shallow draw, and in the draw she saw the town. 9 standing buildings and the bones of 3 others laid along a single street, perhaps 200 paces long, with a dry watercourse running behind them from northwest to southeast, and cottonwoods along the watercourse still living, and a broken windmill at the far end pointing north and northwest with 2 blades gone. She walked down into it slowly. The buildings were of mill pine turned silver by weather, with roofs of shake and tin patched together, and the doors mostly sagging on one hinge or fallen inward, and glass gone from all but 2 windows. She counted, as Hadley had taught her, to count a place before deciding anything about it. A general store with a false front and a collapsed rear wall. A blacksmith's shed with the forge still standing, and the bellows split and hanging like a bat. A livery with its west stalls caved in, and the east 3 sound. A stone and frame building she took for the schoolhouse. A shelf on the north wall with tin cups, and a blue enamel pitcher cracked around the lip, and a second room behind a curtain of faded ticking that held a rope bed frame without a mattress and a small pine chest painted green and blistered. Everything smelled of dust and mouse and old cedar, and the faint, clean iron smell of a place that had not been damp. She stood in the middle of the room and put her hand in her coat pocket and felt the whistle, and she said aloud to no one that it would do. Then she went out to the well behind the house and found the rope still on the crank and the bucket at the bottom sound. And she drew up water that came clear after the 3rd pull, and she carried the bucket back inside and set it on the table beside her basket, and she began without hurry to sweep. She swept for 2 hours with a broom she made by binding a bundle of dry sage to a length of picket she pulled from the fence, and she carried out 4 loads of dust and mouse layings and 1 dead sparrow in her apron, and she scrubbed the table down to pale wood with sand and water, and she scrubbed the hearthstone. And it was while scrubbing the hearthstone that she noticed the mortar along its front edge was newer than the mortar along its sides, and packed in with a finger rather than a trowel, and set unevenly, as though someone had done it in a hurry or in the dark. Hadley had taught her to examine broken things carefully, and to trust the eye that noticed what did not match. She fetched the poker from the hearth iron rack, wedged its tip into the seam, and worked it back and forth until the mortar crumbled in dry, chalky flakes. And then she set her hands under the front edge of the hearthstone, and lifted, and the stone came up in 1 piece, 6 in thick and about 2 feet square, heavier than she expected, and she leaned it against the wall. Beneath the stone was a shallow cavity lined with brick, and in the cavity sat a tin biscuit box painted with faded roses, and beside the box a small oilcloth bundle tied with twine. She lifted the box first, and it rattled softly, and she set it on the table and untied the twine on the bundle and opened the oilcloth. And inside was a leather pouch, and inside the pouch was money. Gold coin, 32, double eagles stacked in 2 columns of 16, and a smaller bag of silver dollars, 41 of them, which she counted twice, and folded beneath the pouch a bank draft on a street, Joseph Institution, for $212 made out to bearer. She sat down on the floor with her back against the hearth and let her hands rest on her knees for a long moment before she opened the biscuit tin. Inside the tin was a folded letter written in a careful, sloping hand on 4 sheets of ruled paper. And beneath the letter, a small tint type of a young woman, about Elizabeth's own age, standing beside an older woman in a bonnet. And beneath the tint type, a tin whistle, 3 and 1 in long, hammered with 6 holes, the twin of the one in Elizabeth's pocket, down to the dent under the 2nd hole, except that this one was brighter at the mouthpiece and unworn. She lifted the whistle out and held it in her palm, and felt the room go very still around her, and she unfolded the letter and turned toward the window to read it. And the letter began, "To whoever finds this, my name is Iona Fletcher, and I lived in this house 41 years. She read the letter through once without moving, and then she read it again, aloud in a low voice, as if the empty room deserved to hear it. And Iona Fletcher's careful, sloping hand told her that Iona had come to Dry Creek in 1867 with her husband and a boy of 4, that the boy had died in 1871 and the husband in 1884, that she had kept the house and the small garden and the 2 milk goats, and had been the town's letter writer and midwife by turns, and that in the summer of 1888 a company of men had come from the east, claiming to survey for a rail spur, and had instead sunk test pits north of the watercourse, and told no one had found, and that within a year every well in the north half of town had begun to taste of copper and iron, and something bitter behind it, and that 4 children had sickened, and 2 had died, and that the company had paid the county quietly to strike the town from its rolls, so that no claim could be brought against the water or the land, and that the remaining families had drifted to Sagebrush, Holt, or farther, and that Iona had stayed because she was old, and because the south wells fed by the cottonwood draw still ran clean, and that she had set aside what she could from 41 years of small work for whoever came after. And she hoped it would be a Fletcher, and she hoped that Fletcher would carry the paper she had folded beneath the tint type to the State Archive in Topeka and set the record straight. Elizabeth found the paper folded small, a page of the county survey, with the test pits marked in pencil and a name and a company written along the margin in Iona's hand. She refolded the letter and set it on the table beside the whistle and the tint type and the bank draft, and then she stood up and went out to the porch and looked at the light on the grass and understood that she would not be leaving. She slept that first night on her folded coat on the plank floor with the whistle in her hand. In the morning she began. She swept the 2nd room and mended the bed frame with rope she braided from strips of an old grain sack she found in the livery. She patched the front with oiled paper cut to size. She fixed the pine table's broken leg by planing a new one from a livery rail and pegging it in with a nail drawn from the porch and hammered straight on the hearthstone. On the fourth day, a man came down the wagon track on a bay horse and stopped at her gate and did not dismount until she came out. His name was Otis Renert. I was 58, and he ran cattle on the flat 6 mi east, and he had seen her smoke and had ridden over to see who was burning wood in Dry Creek. She told him her name and showed him the deed. He read it slowly. He said he had known Josiah Fletcher, that Josiah had been a fair man, and that if she meant to stay, he would send his boy over with a wagon of split cottonwood on Saturday. He did. The boy was Merritt Renert, 16, quiet, and he stacked the wood along the north wall of the house without being asked, and helped her rehang the front door on its lower hinge before he rode back. On the following Tuesday, a wagon came from Sagebrush Halt, carrying Mrs. Delia Aninsley, the station master's wife, 61, a small woman with hands red from lye, who had heard from her husband that a Fletcher girl had walked north into the wind and had decided to see for herself. She brought a sack of cornmeal, a crock of lard, 6 eggs packed in oats, a bolt of unbleached muslin, and a cast-iron spider for cooking on the hearth. She stayed the afternoon and showed Elizabeth how the south well ran and how to test the north wells with a copper coin left overnight. And she agreed with Iona's letter that the north water was still bad and would likely stay bad for a lifetime. Before she left, she wrote her name and the date on the inside of the pantry door in pencil and told Elizabeth to do the same for every person who helped so that the house would keep its own record. Elizabeth did. A week later, a freighter named William Boy, 44, Dutch by his father, hauling salt north to the reservation, stopped for water at the south well and stayed 2 days to help her raise the collapsed rear wall of the general store with a block and tackle he carried in his wagon, refusing pay and taking instead a jar of honey. Mrs. Aninsley had left, and the promise of coffee whenever he passed. In the 3rd week, a widow named Ruth Amberley, 39, who lived alone 8 miles west with a flock of 40 sheep, arrived on foot leading a nanny goat on a rope, and said the goat was surplus, and Elizabeth had the look of someone who could use milk, and she stayed to help re-chink the south wall of the house with clay from the watercourse and straw from the livery loft. And she came back every second Sunday after that with cheese and news. Elizabeth wrote to the State Archive in Topeka in the 4th week, enclosing a careful copy of Iona's marked survey and the names from the margin and a plain letter of her own, asking that the striking of Dry Creek from the county rolls in 1889 be examined. And she paid the postage from the silver dollars and kept the gold sealed in the biscuit tin beneath a floorboard. She pried and refit it under the bed. By the end of the 2nd month, the front room had a scrubbed floor and a mended table and 2 chairs sound enough to sit in, and a rocker with new rockers cut from ash by Merritt Renert on his father's shave, and a shelf where the blue enamel pitcher stood beside the tin cups with the crack turned to the wall, and above the hearth on 2 iron nails, Elizabeth had hung the 2 whistles side by side, Hades on the left and Iona's on the right, and beneath them the tint type of the young woman and the older woman in a bonnet, and beside the tint type the photograph of her mother at age 18, and the 4 objects together made a small, quiet altar that she passed and touched with her fingers each morning before she went out to work. By autumn, the people who came to Dry Creek knew her name and used it without hesitation. Otis Renert brought a pair of laying hens in a slatted crate and would not take money for them, and Elizabeth in return mended a bridle for him with a stitch. Hadley had taught her that held stronger than the original. William Boy began routing his salt run through Dry Creek once a month, and sleeping in the livery's east stalls, which she had cleaned and rested, and paying her 20 cents a night for the hay and a hot supper. And she kept a 2-column ledger of what he owed and what he paid in the manner Hetty had shown her, and it balanced every time. Ruth Amberley's goat gave milk enough for cheese, and Elizabeth learned to press it with a wooden mould Merritt made for her from scrap pine. And on Sundays, when Ruth came, they worked together at the table with the door open to the south wind. Mrs. Annesley sent word by every wagon of who was asking after the Fletcher girl in Sagebrush Halt, and there were more each month, and none of them company men. A letter came from Topeka in November, acknowledging receipt of Elizabeth's papers and stating that a clerk had been assigned to examine the 1889 striking. And a second letter came in January, stating that the striking had been found irregular and that Dry Creek would be restored to the county map at the next revision. And Elizabeth folded both letters into the biscuit tin with Ionas and set the tin back beneath the floorboard. She began to keep a small book of the town's history at the pine table in the evenings, writing in the same careful, sloping hand she had unconsciously begun to imitate from Iona's letter. And she recorded the names of the dead children as best she could, reconstruct them from Iona's pages and from what Mrs. Annesley remembered. And she wrote the names of Otis and Merritt Renert and Delia Annesley and William Boy and Ruth Amberley on the first clean page, and the date each had first come and what they had brought. On the inside of the pantry door, the pencil names grew until they reached the hinge. The house smelled now of woodsome smoke and goat milk and clean pine, and the sage broom she remade every fortnight. And the front room in the evenings held lamplight and the low ticking of the hearth, and the people who passed through Dry Creek learned to expect coffee at Elizabeth Fletcher's table, and a place to leave their horse for the night. And they left small things in payment when they had them, and their thanks when they did not. And Elizabeth accepted both the same way, with a nod and her hand briefly on the corner of the table. On an evening in early spring, a year almost to the day since she had stepped down onto the plank platform at Sagebrush Halt, Elizabeth sat in the rocker Merritt had cut new rockers for, and watched the lamplight move on the wall above the hearth. The wind was small that night, the kind Hadley had called a resting wind, and the cottonwoods along the watercourse were beginning to show the first pale fur of leaves. On the 2 iron nails above the hearth, the 2 whistles hung side by side. Hadley's on the left, with its worn silver mouthpiece and its dent under the second hole. Ionas on the right, still bright and unworn, and between and below them, the tint type of the young woman standing beside the older woman in the bonnet, and the photograph of Elizabeth's mother at 18, with her hand resting on the back of a chair. Elizabeth had passed those 4 things every morning of that year, and touched them with her fingers before going out. And she did so again now, standing up from the rocker and laying the flat of her hand for a moment against each in turn. She thought without wanting to of the small table beside the reading lamp in Adele's parlor, and of the 60 cents counted out onto it, and of the cousins she had never met who had sold Head's quarter section for debts she had never heard of, and of the 11 weeks the lawyer's letter had lain unopened in the top drawer of the sideboard. She thought of these people without heat, and without wishing them any particular harm. They had looked at her and seen a girl who could be used until she was used up. And they had been wrong, and their wrongness was not a thing that required an answer from her. Now the answer was the house around her, and the ledger balanced in 2 columns on the shelf, and the pencil names on the pantry door that had reached the hinge and turned the corner and started down the jamb. She thought of Haidee, who had taught her to count a place before deciding anything about it, and to read a plat map, and to examine broken things carefully, and to trust the eye that noticed what did not match. She thought of Iona Fletcher, whom she had never seen, who had lived in this house 41 years, and had set aside what she could from small work in the hope that a Fletcher would come, and who had folded a page of a county survey beneath a tint type, so that the striking of a town from a map would not be the last words spoken about the water or the children. 2 women, she thought, who had loved someone they never got to see grow up, and who had, between them, made her. She sat back down in the rocker. On the pine table lay the small book of the town's history, open to the page she had been writing that evening, and beside it the tin cup of coffee she had poured for Willem boy, who would be in from the Salt Road before midnight, and would sleep in the east stalls of the livery. From the yard came the soft complaint of Ruth Amberley's goat and the settling of the 2 laying hens. Otis Renard had brought in the slatted crate. Somewhere, out past the cottonwoods, a coyote spoke once and was answered. Elizabeth Fletcher was 19, and then she was 20. She had walked out of Bell Run with $4 in her pocket, and a whistle in her coat, and a deed to a town that did not exist, and she had spent the $4 on the ticket that carried her to it. It was the best $4 she ever spent. If this story sat with you the way Elizabeth's coffee sits with a traveler on the Salt Road, take a moment to subscribe to the channel and share it with someone who has been told that what they were left was nothing. Because sometimes the thing other people cannot see the worth of is the very thing that will carry you the rest of the way home. Leave a comment and tell us where you are watching from tonight. And while you are there, tell us this. Who is the Hetty or the Iona in your own life? The person who saw what you were capable of before you did. And what small thing of theirs do you still carry in your pocket? We will be reading. Settle in, and we will see you at the next